Early childhood, elementary, and secondary education will come to order. Welcome, everyone. I note that a quorum is present. I note for the subcommittees that Ms. Omar of Minnesota, Ms. Wasserman Schultz of Florida, Mr. Bayer of Virginia, Mr. McEachin of Virginia, and Ms. Presley of Massachusetts are permitted to participate in today's hearing with the understanding that their questions will come only after all members of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Subcommittee on both sides of the aisle who are present have had an opportunity to question the witness. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on serving all students, promoting a healthier, more supportive school environment. This is an entirely remote hearing, so all microphones should be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. I also ask that members please identify themselves before they speak. Members should keep their cameras on while in the proceeding. Members shall be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this is if they are experiencing technical difficulty and inform committee staff of such difficulty. If any member experiences technical difficulty during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you're muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulty or need to step away, Mr. Levin or another majority member is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. This is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room is officially closed. Members who choose to sit with their individual devices in the hearing room must wear headphones to avoid feedbacks, echoes, and distortion resulting from more than one person on the software platform sitting in the same room. Members are also expected to adhere to social distancing and safe healthcare guidelines, including the use of masks, hand sanitizer, and wiping down the areas both before and after their presence in the hearing room. And in order to ensure the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's digital timer, which appears on its own thumbnail picture. Members and witnesses are asked to please wrap up promptly when their time has expired. Uh, Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. First, I'd like to welcome our new member who's just joined us today. Welcome to this subcommittee. Today, we're meeting to discuss the federal government's role in helping schools create supportive environments that help all students learn and grow. The COVID-19 pandemic underscored how important schools are to our nation's children, families, and communities. While the initial shift to online learning saved lives, it also restricted access to essential services like social and emotional development, healthy nutrition, and the stability that allows students to thrive. In my district, COVID-19 has had the greatest impact on students with disabilities, Title I qualified students, English learners, and other vulnerable students that already face significant challenges. For students to fully recover from the pandemic and get back on track, children and parents must have the assurance that they're returning to supportive classroom environments. Unfortunately, we know that this is not always the case. Data from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights indicate that far too many students experience harmful discipline practices like corporal punishment, seclusion, and restraint. Over 100,000 students were physically restrained, mechanically restrained, or secluded in public schools during the 2017-18 school year, the last year data were collected. 19 states still allow teachers to strike students in classrooms, and these practices disproportionately impact Black and Latino students and students with disabilities. Research shows that corporal punishment, seclusion, and restraint are linked to lower academic achievement, higher rates of mental health problems, chronic absenteeism, and a higher risk of substance abuse. Tragically, seclusion and restraint practices have also injured teachers and led to students' death. We also know more clearly than ever before that removing children from the classroom stifles academic growth and negatively impacts their mental health. Even still, our education system continues to suspend or expel Black and brown students at disproportionately higher rates than their peers. These punitive practices are contradictory to what we know students need, and they reflect outdated initiatives like zero tolerance policies that demanded harsh and counterproductive discipline. Congress must work to help schools replace outdated practices with evidence based strategies to create healthier school environments for all students. For all students. Research shows that the mental health support and trauma informed care are critical alternatives that better foster students' development. So, to that end, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan in March of last year, 2021, which provided the largest one time federal investment in K 12 schools to help them reopen and stay open safely and make up for lost time in the classroom. The investment dedicated funding specifically to respond to students' academic, social, and emotional needs. An analysis of district level spending plans from Future Ed indicates that many schools are using funds to hire school counselors and mental health professionals who can support students' recovery from the pandemic. And in June, the Biden Harris administration also initiated a process to release new guidance for schools to implement discipline practices that protect students' civil rights. In Congress, Democrats have introduced a number of legislative proposals to support student health and well being, including the Keeping All Students Safe Act, introduced by Chairman Scott and Congressman Beyer. I am a proud co sponsor of this bill. The bill would prohibit seclusion practices in schools, drastically reduce the use of physical restraints, and provide educators the training and support they need to implement evidence based strategies to build healthier school climates. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses this afternoon on the steps we must take to help schools implement proven practices that will support students' academic, social, and emotional development. So I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Owens, for the purpose of making an opening statement. Mr. Owens, please.
Okay, 1 second here.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Committee Republicans believe ensuring student safety in the classroom is of the highest priority. Under the Every Student Succeed Act, each state is required to develop a plan for supporting school districts' efforts to reduce policies that compromise. Can you guys hear me? Am I coming through okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
you are.
All right. Supporting school districts' efforts to reduce policies that compromise the health and safety of students. In fact, 44 states already have laws governing the appropriate use of seclusion and restraint in the classroom, and a majority of states have banned corporal punishment in schools. Local school officials and staff must provide a safe learning environment and culture where all students can thrive. All students must be provided with learning opportunities, and students with disabilities must be accommodated. The way to achieve safer and healthier learning environments in school is not through more federal control and intervention. School districts do not need a more prescriptive one-fits-all mandates from Washington bureaucrats. States and local communities are the most appropriate places to determine the best way to keep students and educators safe. Ultimately, school boards and school officials must work in engaging parents in these important discussions regarding their children's welfare. Parents know what works best for their own children. As a committee dedicated to ensuring that students get the best education possible, we should be more focused on empowering parents. Parents are the biggest and best stakeholders in the children's education and safety. Over the past several months, parents have made it very clear that their child's education is their top priority. All across the country, parents have expressed concerns over the learning loss and mental health issues caused by keeping classrooms closed to appease teachers' unions. Even though we knew that keeping children out of school led to higher rates of depression, suicide attempts, and other serious complications, teachers' unions continue to fight to keep schools closed. It is very clear why parents are so irate. Increasingly, parents are also expressed support for educational freedom. Yet many Democrats have remained adamantly opposed to school choice. Keeping families from picking this educational environment that is right for them shows that Democrats do not put students first, nor are they willing to put the education of their child over politics. It is time for Democrats to admit that we are in a booming new era of parental engagement and freedom, educational freedom. It is an era based on choice instead of force. We all share a desire to ensure that our children have a safe and healthy learning environment, but we disagree on how best to accomplish this goal. These last 2 years have shown that Democrats believe in one-size-fits-all mandates from Washington, D.C. Republicans, on the other hand, believe that in local decision-making informed by honest and robust engagement with the parents. We also believe in expanding educational freedom to give parents options for finding the best and safest educational environment for their children. As a national leader, the legislature from my home state of Utah is currently working to increase educational options for parents and students. We must make the concerns of parents a top priority. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Owens. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March the 2nd. I will now introduce our witnesses. Mr. Guy Stephens is the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. He is the father whose autistic son, Cooper, was inappropriately restrained and secluded in a Maryland school. 3 years ago, Guy started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint to raise awareness and promote legislative change to reduce and eliminate the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. Guy is also a board member of the ARC of Maryland and a member of the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPAA. Welcome, Mr. Stephens. Ms. Morgan Craven is the National Director of Policy Advocacy and Community Engagement for the Intercultural Development Research Association, or IDRA. Previously, Ms. Craven directed Texas Appleseed School to Prison Pipeline Project, and in that role, she presented research and data to policymakers and developed policies and advocacy campaigns related to school discipline, school policing, and school climate. Welcome, Ms. Craven. Mr. Max Eden is a research fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education reform, specifically K-12 and early childhood education. Before his current role at AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He has authored a number of reports and studies on education and testified about school violence before Congress and about the school-to-prison pipeline before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He has a BA in history from Yale University. Welcome, Mr. Eden. And Ms. Kristen Harper is the Vice President for Public Policy and Engagement at Child Trans. As a nationally recognized expert, she supports research projects to examine state school health policies, evaluate discipline, policy implementation, and strengthen coordination between health and education systems. Previously, as part of the Obama administration, Kristen held federal initiatives to strengthen equitable implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and advance a whole child focus within education system across the country. Welcome, Ms. Harper. We appreciate the witnesses for participating today and look forward to your testimony. Let me please remind the witnesses that we have your written testimony and there will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and the committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone, and during your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and a light will blink when time is up. Please be attentive to the time, wrap up when your time is over, and remute your microphone. Excuse me. If any of you experience technical difficulty during your testimony or later in the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you're muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided to you in advance. We will let all witnesses make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone, and the witnesses are aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee, and therefore we will proceed with your testimony. Let me first recognize Mr. Stephens. Sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Chairman LaBlanc, Ranking Member Owens, and Chairman Scott, members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm a father and the executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Today, I'm here on behalf of my autistic son, Cooper, and the many other parents who have shared their stories with me. Cooper is 16 years old. He loves science, nature, spending time on the Chesapeake Bay. Cooper was physically restrained and secluded for the first time when he was just 6 years old. Cooper was again restrained and secluded when he was 13 years old. The last instance was particularly traumatic and left him afraid to return to school. Maryland law was not enough to save my son from a traumatic experience that will be with him for the rest of his life. Cooper was not restrained and secluded because he posed the danger of serious physical injury to himself or someone else. Cooper was restrained and secluded because of the training and culture in his school. I spoke to Cooper about what had been done to him. I made a promise to Cooper that I would do anything in my power to make sure it never happened to him again. That promise has completely changed my life. I immersed myself in research. I wanted to understand why this was happening. Children with disabilities, Black and brown children, and children with a trauma history are disproportionately restrained and secluded. It's most often children as young as 5, 6, and 7 years old. According to the Office of Civil Rights, students with disabilities make up around 13% of the population of our public schools, yet they accounted for 80% of physical restraints and 77% of seclusions. Reflecting on these numbers, it's clear that this is a civil rights issue. We must do something to protect the civil and human rights of our most vulnerable children. The next thing I wanted to understand was the impact of restraint and seclusion. Research shows that restraint and seclusion can result in trauma, injury, and even death. Being held to the ground or forced into a seclusion room is traumatizing. And trauma causes changes in the brain that can lead a child to be fearful and hypervigilant, often increasing distress behaviors. It's also traumatic on the other children who witness classmates being physically restrained or secluded. Injuries are common with restraint and seclusion. We've seen children and educators who have suffered from broken bones, head trauma, bruises, scratches, and other injuries. While we often hear proponents of restraint and seclusion say they feel these interventions are necessary to keep everyone safe, in truth, most injuries occur during restraint or seclusion events. Sadly, many deaths have been due to the use of physical restraint and seclusion. Cornelius Frederick, a Michigan student, died in 2021 after being placed in a prone restraint because he threw a sandwich in a cafeteria. Max Benson, a young autistic student in California, died in 2018 after being placed in a prone restraint. These are lives that shouldn't have ended this way. We sometimes hear the myth that restraint is safe. Some might even tell you it's therapeutic. Physical restraint is a crisis intervention only intended for life-threatening situations. It is not therapeutic. The only safe restraint is when all parties are willing to participate, such as might occur in a training event. In real-life situations, restraint and seclusion lead to a fight or flight response, where children will do all they can to escape. And this increases the likelihood that someone will get injured or worse. We also hear the myth that seclusion is safe and calming. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is nothing calming about being thrown into a room against your will alone while the door is being held shut. Children may initially respond by kicking, screaming, beating on the walls to escape. Eventually, lacking the capacity, again, very young students, to self-regulate, the child's brain will begin to shut down and they may enter a brain survival state. This is not calm. The final myth I'd like to address is that there are no other choices, that restraint and seclusion are necessary. In fact, there are many trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, and relationship-driven approaches to reduce restraint and seclusion. We need trainings to support, which will come with the Keeping All Students Safe Act, to create safer schools for students, teachers, and staff. In 2009, the GAO published a report titled Select Cases of Death and Abuse at Public and Private Schools. The report found hundreds of cases of death and abuse related to restraint and seclusion. Had federal legislation been passed following that report, I might not be sitting here before you today, and my son and many others might have avoided lifelong trauma. Please support CASA. When I say to you that what happened to my son has changed my life, it is no exaggeration. 3 years ago, I started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I've devoted thousands of hours to researching the issue and promoting positive change. I've talked to thousands of parents and families that have been impacted. I do this for my son and the many children and families that are impacted. Thank you for hearing my story today, and I look forward to answering questions later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Stevens, and thank you for sharing this personal story about your family. Our prayers go to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me see. I think next we'll hear from Miss Craven. Miss Craven, you have 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Sablan, Ranking Member Owens, Chairman Scott, and members of the committee. My name is Morgan Craven. I am the National Director of Policy Advocacy and Community Engagement at IDRA. In addition to research and advocacy, IDRA provides training and support to educators, schools, and education agencies in 11 southern states and Washington, D.C. In my testimony, I'd like to share information about corporal punishment, what it takes to foster safe, culturally sustaining, and supportive schools for all students, and why it is past time for federal action to eliminate corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is a particularly brutal form of punishment. It involves spanking, paddling, slapping, and hitting, or otherwise inflicting physical pain on children, some as young as preschool age, allegedly as a form of discipline. I encounter a lot of people who are shocked the practice still exists in schools, and we should all be shocked by that. Not only is it baffling that anyone would be allowed to hit a single child in school, but the frequency with which corporal punishment is used is horrifying. In the 2017-18 school year, approximately 70,000 children were hit in their schools. We know that corporal punishment is used disproportionately against Black children and other children of color. Though they are not more likely to break school rules, they are more likely to be hit in their schools. Black students received 37% of all corporal punishments in 2017-18, but only made up 15% of the public school population. Children with disabilities who should be receiving other supports in accordance with federal law are also disproportionately hit in their schools. And this is happening even though the harms of corporal punishment are really clear. Students suffer physical harm, including injuries that require medical attention like bruising and broken bones. They also suffer academically and socially. They experience humiliation and anxiety, and they feel disconnected from their teachers, schools, and academic careers. Corporal punishment also impacts the entire school, creating climates that center violence rather than safety, which makes it difficult for everyone to learn and thrive. When an adult hits a student, it suggests to every other child in the room that when they have a conflict with someone, violence is an appropriate resolution, particularly violence against the students who are disproportionately hit. And this is a really dangerous model for students who are developing social skills and learning about interpersonal relationships. Corporal punishment persists even though we know what works to support children and create safe schools for them. IDRA works with schools and educators across the South, and the most common type of request for assistance we get is for help moving away from harmful exclusionary discipline and school policing. Educators desperately want to understand what they should do, what programs they should implement to support students. They do not want to hit children because it is ineffective, counterproductive, and not why they became educators. We encourage these schools and educators to think about people, like having diverse and well-trained counselors, social workers, nurses, and teachers. We encourage them to think about policies like ending corporal punishment, and we help them understand practices like adopting research-based strategies that change school-wide cultures and focus on building strong and authentic relationships between everyone in a school community. There is so much consensus around the harms of corporal punishment that hitting children, and adults for that matter, is banned in nearly every other context and would in many cases be considered assault. Some states that allow corporal punishment in schools ban it in juvenile detention centers, foster care settings, jails, and prisons because of the harm it can cause. Corporal punishment is also banned in federal programs, including Head Start and Department of Defense schools. No school should be paddling, spanking, slapping, or hitting children, full stop. Our nation has a problem of violence against children perpetrated in schools and sanctioned by states. It is past time for federal action on this issue because corporal punishment is a relic that 19 states just refuse to get rid of. And part of the reason for that is the issue is always framed as someone else's problem. A local school board or a campus principal or a parent who is asked to opt in or out of a corporal punishment policy. But that cannot be the way we think about corporal punishment given what we know about the harm that it causes to our students. There is no individual, parental, local, or state interest that should supersede the interest in protecting children from being hit in their schools. The federal government has the responsibility to protect students, to step in when states fail to act, and to ensure oversight and accountability when it comes to the federal resources that are sent to public schools across the country. You also have the opportunity to support school communities to make the right choices and pursue a vision of safe and supportive classrooms for all students. Corporal punishment, which is inherently about fear, violence, and trauma, is antithetical to that vision. I urge you to act immediately to eliminate corporal punishment through the Protecting Our Students in Schools Act and support other bills that end harmful discipline and policing practices while investing in research-based methods to support schools and students. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Craven. And so next, let me invite Mr. Eden. Please, Mr. Eden, you have 5 minutes.
Great. Good afternoon, and thank you all for the opportunity to address the essential issue of safe, healthy, and supportive schools. I would be remiss if I did not begin by addressing the root cause of the current mental health and school safety crisis plaguing American school children: teachers' unions and their allies. They exploited the pandemic and effectively held kids hostage for their own financial and political benefit. And they did this under the name of science. But legitimate social science has demonstrated that after the initial viral panic, school closures were not driven by the prevalence of community spread. They were driven, rather, by the strength of teachers' unions and by the partisanship of their fellow travelers. Furthermore, public records requests have demonstrated that the Biden administration rewrote COVID guidance after being given a homework assignment by the unions. To paraphrase, please rework these with an eye towards our collective bargaining negotiations. Now, it will take legitimate medical and social scientists years to sort through the sheer and utter wreckage that these teachers' unions have caused. Perhaps some children were spared a physical disease that, for them, was less deadly than the flu, but warning signs of the true costs have been flashing red: rises in mental illness and a spike in school violence. Untold emotional and social damage has been done by refusing to allow students to see each other's faces and by programming them to look at their friends as vectors of disease. I expect that this chapter in American history will be looked back upon as a peculiarly American atrocity against our nation's children. These themes also relate to a bill that this committee is considering. The same sort of science is on display, looking at numbers that don't truly say what they seem to say, failing to contextualize them properly in the complex reality of human nature, and then taking an aggressive measure that runs an obvious risk of doing profound harm to children. A measure that, if history is any guide, could be declared a success, despite its virtually, if not literally, incalculable damage to children. This committee is considering a bill to curb seclusion and restraint. Certainly, the numbers look very upsetting before you seriously analyze them. And certainly, many of us have seen outrageous viral videos or heard horrible stories of restraint and seclusion gone very wrong. Terrible images, terrible stories that reflect malpractice that everyone should oppose. But anyone who has ever been to school also knows that sometimes situations escalate beyond the power of a teacher's calming word. The question then becomes not whether, but rather how they will be restrained and secluded. Now, Oregon attempted something very much like what this committee is considering opposing on the entire United States of America. And we know what happened next there. What happened next was room clears. Have you heard of room clears? I hadn't until a couple of years ago. In a room clear, the entire class is evacuated. The troubled student is left to destroy the room if he so chooses until he calms down. The other students are ushered into the hallways, their learning disrupted, their psyches disturbed. According to one survey, 56% of Oregon teachers and parents reported having experienced a room clear in their or their child's schools. Now, it's easy for some of us here in DC to believe that we have the answers to America's education problems. But it's unfortunately all too hard for anyone to admit when their proposed solution has actually made the problem worse. There's a clear parallel here in the Obama administration's lenient school discipline initiative. Policymakers saw substantial racial disparities in school suspensions, and they pushed to make it harder for teachers to suspend students. What happened next? Well, The results from the studies are in. In Philadelphia, substantial damage to reading and math scores. In California, substantial damage to math achievement. In Pittsburgh, a randomized controlled trial of restorative justice found academic harm to Black students in particular. School climate surveys have shown substantial deteriorations in measures of healthy and supportive schools. And yet, I've never once seen an advocate of this policy initiative fundamentally reconsider whether maybe they didn't really understand the root cause of the problem they were trying to solve, and whether they maybe really didn't have a better answer on offer. As with school suspensions, I fear we know what will happen if Congress passes a bill on restraining seclusion. The numbers will go down. Activists will cheer first, but then insist that we still must do much more. Students and teachers will face ever greater physical danger, but no one will speak for them. The teachers' union certainly will not. If their actions on school discipline are any guide, they will prioritize social justice ideology over the physical safety of the teachers and students they purport to protect.
Mr. Eden, could you close up, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. Ultimately, the real path towards safer and supportive schools is being walked by parents across America at school board meetings. Instead of slandering these parents, instead of raising the specter of the Patriot Act against them, Congress should not seek new ways to impose its will on local school districts. It should seek ways to empower parents with knowledge and power to make the schools that serve their children safer as they know best.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Eden. And finally, we'll have Ms. Harper. Ms. Harper, please, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Sablan, Ranking Member Owens, Chairman Scott, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for elevating the importance of supportive learning environments. Child Trends is a nonpartisan research institute committed to serving office holders of both parties. On behalf of Child Trends, I am grateful for this opportunity to share 3 lessons drawn from research. First, our most effective strategy for creating safe and healthy schools is by mitigating risk factors and promoting protective factors. In public health, this is called prevention. Second, exclusionary discipline is an obstacle to improving student health and school climates. Third, there are effective programs and school-wide approaches to help schools focus on prevention and deliver services our children need. So first, prevention. Supportive learning environments are foundational, supporting student achievement and mental health, and to promoting school recovery from COVID-19. To create such environments, prevention should be our primary strategy, with comprehensive health, mental health, and social services as our primary tactic. With a prevention strategy, we can help schools to mitigate risk factors and increase protective factors with the goal of reducing threats to student health, safety, and academic success. Two of the most important protective factors are teacher-student relationships and students' feelings of connection to school. Students that feel connected to school and to staff are less likely to engage in risky behaviors, less likely to be absent from school, and less likely to experience emotional distress. However, school reliance on suspension and expulsion, on exclusionary discipline, is the antithesis of a prevention strategy. During the 2017-2018 school year, the average K-12 school suspended 4.5% of their students. Schools continue to suspend Black students and students with disabilities at higher rates. The average school suspended 7.8% of Black students and 8.5% of students with disabilities. These are not small figures. Annual suspension rates are useful for monitoring trends, but don't tell the full story. Studies have estimated that roughly 1/3 of students are suspended during their school career. Second, exclusionary discipline puts student mental health and COVID-19 recovery at risk. 10 years ago, a landmark study connected exclusionary discipline to an increased risk of school dropout and juvenile justice contact. Research has since shown that suspended students are less likely to earn a bachelor's degree and more likely to experience expulsion, arrest, and incarceration. The pandemic has heightened the consequences of exclusionary discipline, particularly for children suffering from trauma after witnessing violence or losing a loved one. As of June 2021, roughly 1 out of 500 children lost a parent or grandparent to COVID-19. Not every child that experiences adversity will suffer from trauma, as community and family supports can mitigate the impacts. Of course, the need for social distancing has separated children from the supports they rely on to cope. Children with trauma experience shifts in behavior, attention difficulties, and challenges building relationships. This means that children with trauma bear the cost when schools rely on exclusion rather than prevention. For these students, suspension is a uniquely damaging approach as it interrupts their connection to the school community at precisely the time they need connection. Third, there are a range of programs and school-wide approaches available to help schools advance a prevention strategy. I'll give a few. Social emotional learning programs build student skills, such as relationship skills and responsible decision-making. A review of 213 studies connected SEL to reduced emotional distress and reduced challenges with behavior. School-wide approaches with strong evidence include community schools, which feature integrated health and social services and multi-tiered systems of support. The work of creating healthy and safe schools where students have access to services and strong relationships with adults built on trust is an ongoing endeavor. To be safe and resilient, schools need consistent support for services, training, collaboration, data collection, and coordination. As of June 2021, 1 in 500 children lost a parent or grandparent to COVID-19. Please let that sink in. We must create schools that serve all students. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Harper, and thank you to all our witnesses for their opening statements. Under Committee Rule 9A, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will be recognizing subcommittee members in seniority order. And again, to ensure that the members' 5-minute rules adhere to, staff will be keeping track of time, and the timer will show a blinking light when the time has expired. So please be attentive to the time wrap up when your time is over and remute your microphone. As chair, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Last year, Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan, which delivered an historic $130 billion investment to help K-12 schools safely open and address students' academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs. An analysis of district-level ARP plans from Future Ed indicates that spending on social, emotional learning and student mental health are key priorities for districts across the country. This is the case in my district, where ARP funds, about no less than 160 million, have been used to provide social emotional counseling to students and staff. So, Ms. Harper, let me ask, how can districts use the American Rescue Plan funding to create positive and welcoming school climates, particularly at this moment in time? And have you seen any promising examples in your research?
Thank you so much for that question. One thing that's important to know is that there's generally not a one-size-fits-all approach that will work for all schools. The approach we take has to be tailored to the specific needs of a school community, the specific needs of the students within that community. That said, districts should really take this opportunity to focus on updating infrastructure and addressing systemic challenges to reap long-term benefits. Right now, school systems should be investing in collecting data directly from students, from staff, from other community members to assess needs and identify where additional supports are needed. And student mental health is absolutely a priority, but this is an area where we have long faced workforce shortages that have only caused even more challenge, as we headed into the pandemic. So how do we create pipelines that ensure that the mental health workforce is there to support all of our nation's schools?
Thank you. And the 2018 GAO study on discipline disparities found that corporal punishment disproportionately harms certain students, including students of color and students with disabilities, even though these students do not misbehave at higher rates than their white or non-disabled peers. So can you please elaborate further on these disparities and where they are most pronounced? Ms. Harper? Someone else?
I'm happy to answer that question. I know you referenced corporal punishment, so I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. And thank you for that question. We know that, like other forms of punitive discipline in school policing, corporal punishment is used disproportionately against Black students. As I mentioned in my testimony, in the 2017-18 school year, the rate of Black students being hit was twice as high as that of white students. In Mississippi, where about a quarter of instances of corporal punishment in the US take place, we know that Black children accounted for about 63% of the students corporally punished, even though they only made up 49% of the student population. And Black girls in particular received 73% of the punishments given to girls in that state. And so the root of your question is really important, Mr. Chairman. These students are not more likely to misbehave. We know that from lots of research, and we know that from common sense. There's nothing about Black students that makes them more likely to break rules. But what is true across all types of punishment is that Black students and other students of color, like Latinx and Indigenous students, are more likely than their peers to be punished, and punished harshly. And that really has to do with how adults are viewing these students and making assumptions about their behavior and their culpability. It has to do with systems, so the policies and practices that enable adults in schools to punish students in ineffective and harmful ways. And as you point out, we also know that students with disabilities experience higher rates of corporal punishment than their peers without disabilities. They accounted for 21% of corporal punishments that same year, even though they make up about 15% of the student population. And again, this shouldn't be happening to them. Students with disabilities may need specific supports and services and should have those, but when schools are not providing those services to students, they're instead relying on corporal punishment and other types of punitive discipline and policing.
Yeah, the quickest action is the first thought that comes to mind, but we've got to change that mindset. So I now would like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Owens, for his 5 minutes of questioning. So Mr. Owens, please, sir.
Thank you. Let me just start off with first of all saying to Mr. Stevens that I applaud you for the father you are. You remind me of my dad, remind me of the kind of dad that I wanted to be, make sure I was engaged, protect my son. Unfortunately, the downside is that between 70 to 80% of Black boys and girls in this country do not have the kind of dads that are talking on this conversation right now. They're not taught to be disciplined. I grew up in a segregated home, segregated community, and we were taught to respect elders, respect our teachers. If we were in any trouble in school, we were in trouble at home. So let's also not conflate. And by the way, I should also say I have a very, very talented grandson who's autistic. So I understand that there's a special need, there's a special patience, and that should always be the case, whether it be in the homes or be in the school system. Let's not conflate those disabilities with Black kids. When we have children that are not being taught to be disciplined, to be taught that they can create chaos and not be given some kind of control, then we're gonna have some issues. We cannot lower our standards. And I'm reminded, for those who don't know, and the teachers unions in California a few years ago had tried to bring in a second form of language called Ebonics, because the teachers were not teaching their kids. They wanted to lower the standards that these kids get a second language, as opposed, and this, by the way, for those who don't know what Ebonics is all about, it's a slang that doesn't get anybody any success. But these are the kind of things we have to make sure we're not lowering our standards. We make sure those kids that are in the school systems are getting what they deserve, a good a classroom that's safe, they can learn and not have chaos in the process. So just want to make that point. Mr. Eden, so much the focus on this conversation is on individual students who are subjected to discipline. And it's appropriate to draw attention to those students, especially when those instances are unjust treatment. Those injustices should be addressed. However, we don't focus enough on the impact on the rest of the students and the overall school climate when discipline standards in a classroom are reduced. You cite research showing that academic outcomes go down when discipline standards are reduced. Why is that? And who are the students most often impacted by the lower academic outcomes? Mr. Eden.
Yes, thank you for the question, Representative Owens. And it's a very important question because we should be able to distinguish between individuals who are being treated unjustly by professional malpractice and the question of maintaining safe, orderly, and supportive schools. Quite frequently, when a teacher's hands are tied from exercising prudent discipline, not the malpractice form we're all opposed to, but from exercising their good professional judgment over what they think needs to be done to maintain safe classrooms, the rest of the school will suffer. We've seen this in data and research, in particular in the case of Philadelphia, where the school district banned suspensions for willful misconduct. And what happened next was substantial damage to reading scores, substantial damage to math scores. Suspensions for serious infractions actually went up significantly, and truancy in the Philadelphia school district went from about 25% to 40%. So what that suggests to me is that when teachers are given the ability to implement the kind of discipline that they think there is needed, there might sometimes be some cost to the student who's disciplined, although that is going to be vastly overstated by inadequate research. But mostly we've seen that when teachers don't have the chance to use their good judgment, the rest of the students will suffer. And to the degree that these classes are disproportionately minority, disproportionately serve students with disability, it's going to be those students who are hurt the most by these policy initiatives.
I'd also like to make a point because it's common sense. We have families that are not successful, not teaching their kids, they're going to have a higher percentage of disruption. And for those who are not aware, when you have between 70 to 80% of Black children not having fathers in the household, you're going to see an uptick in crime, uptick in illiteracy, uptick in all the negative factors. And those are what we're seeing in our classroom. So let's not look at the percentage of Blacks in our classroom. Let's look at the percentage of what's happening for those coming into the classroom and not being trained to be respectful. And therefore, that's going to be a higher percentage of those kids that are in trouble and being suspended, because at the end of the day, it is all about chaos. And I see I only have a few seconds here. Do you have anything you just want to wrap up with for the last 14 seconds I have?
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely true. There's nothing intrinsic about a Black kid, a white kid, an Asian kid that leads to misbehavior, but coming from a single parent household, coming from a poor community, all of these structures, that in all of these other segments, I frequently hear from the Democratic side of the aisle that there are structural inequities. It's just strange to me that they ignore that when it comes to things that affect how students live and promote this line that there are no behavioral differences, which is not quite true.
Thank you so much. I've run out of time. You're back. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Let me again, I'm trying to get her name correct here. Let me again welcome to our committee, Congresswoman Sherphyllis McCormick. I hope I got that right. My goodness. Yes. I may have to say Ms. McCormick, but now I'd like to recognize Congresswoman McBath. Lucy, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I didn't expect to be called on so early, Chairman Sablan, but thank you so much. And also thank you to Chairman Scott, head of the full committee, and Mr. Sablan. Thank you so very much for having this hearing today. And to all our guests who have joined us, thank you to you for being here to discuss this very critically important topic of keeping our children safe and healthy in schools. You know, this week is an incredibly difficult week for me and for, just for so many weeks and it's for so many families across the country and for so many students and parents and just people who have been devastated by the scourge of gun violence in our country. This week, as the country and I continue to mourn 17 students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Today, I also mourn and commemorate what would have been my son's 27th birthday. For me and for the survivors who remain behind, the pain of losing a loved one never, ever goes away. And you carry it with you every single day, deep in your soul. And it's something that I never, ever would wish on anyone. But that possibility is a reality that students and their parents are facing every single day as they walk their kids to school or, they drop them off at the bus stop every morning. From monthly lockdown drills to buying bulletproof backpacks, students and teachers and parents are saddled with the mental hardship and lasting trauma that they never had to face before school shootings began occurring at such a terrifying frequency that our nation now just considers a new normal. According to the Washington Post, there were at least 42 acts of gun violence committed during regular hours on K-12 campuses around the country just this year. And just this year, the highest number of these acts were committed in a single school year, even though most schools were still closed to in-person instruction for the first 2 months of the school year. This is a preventable crisis that we just can't afford to ignore any longer. And it's, critical that we take steps to address the epidemic of gun violence and school shootings that continue to plague our country every single day. And every day that we do nothing, we allow more and more families to be torn apart and emotionally scarred, like mine. And it expresses more and more to students and parents and teachers that it's normal for them to bear these emotional scars of losing a loved one or being maimed and killed at a moment's notice. This is the reality that I and so many families like mine, we live this every single day. And it's one that we must not continue to allow to become the new normal for our students, for our teachers, and for our families. So my question is for Ms. Harper. Today, many students are facing trauma that could have a lifelong impact. And we're talking about trauma today, including the trauma of gun violence. And according to the CDC, over 45,000 people died from gun violence in 2020. Now, this constitutes a 15% increase from 2019 and the most gun deaths of any year that's on record. Ms. Harper, should common sense gun reform just be part of the solution to create supportive and healthy schools?
Thank you so much for your question and for sharing your experience. Child Trends hasn't done research on gun policy, but we do know well the cost that firearms have had on the lives of children and youth, and that cost is high. In 2019, looking at deaths of white adolescents between the ages of 15 and 19, 1/4, 25%, were the result of a firearm injury. Looking at males, all males within the same age range, that figure increases to over 1/3. Firearms are the second leading cause of death for children and youth under the age of 19, second only to car crashes. It's the leading.
I apologize. I need to.
No problem.
Please wrap it up. I apologize. Thank you. I need time here. But thank you. Lucy, you still have the time.
Pardon,
Ms.
sir?
McBath. Yeah, it's still your time. You haven't yielded, but it's
okay.
over.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I yield back. I'm out of time. I apologize.
Thank you. I apologize too. Thank you. And I'm sorry, Lucy, about the pain you're going through. It's common here at home, and I'm sure throughout the whole world, that children are supposed to be the ones burying their parents, not the other way. So I can't imagine the time you go through. But and now I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Dr. Fox. Dr. Fox, please, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being here. Mr. Eaton, you mentioned in your testimony that teachers' unions are the greatest threat to student health and safety. Could you please explain more why you believe this to be the case and what steps Congress could take to address this?
I mean, absolutely. I think the most obvious is what they have done over the past 2 years during this pandemic. It was obvious, it was cynical, it was exploitative. They kept children out of schools, they kept masks on children. This did profound social and emotional damage. And this was done for cynical, political, and financial self-interested reasons that were clothed by this ideology and called science. Now, that's of course not the only harm that they do. They have supported all sorts of policies that they know from local surveys have put their own teachers and students in physical danger. They have shown a total willingness to prioritize ideology over safety in all facets of education. Furthermore, when it comes to issues that parents care about with particular respect to their students' physical and emotional health, teachers' unions have become the cornerstone of pushing a certain ideology, a very divisive, racial, frequently very sexualized ideology on young children, and calling it mental health initiatives. This is something that also stands to do profound damage to children in terms of steps that Congress could take. At some level, it's a state issue. At some level, there are federal steps. For one thing, we basically know that teachers' unions operate functionally as a Democratic Party super PAC. Depending on the union, somewhere between 96 to I think 99% of the donations go to the Democratic Party, but that does not yield, that's not the full extent of it. They also frequently contract in ways that aren't subject to financial disclosure with a whole host of other entities that push these frequently very harmful policies as well. So fuller transparency over where this taxpayer money is going would I think do a lot to show parents what's really being done with the money, what's being pushed into schools, and who profits frequently at students' expense.
Thank you, Mr. Eden. You also discussed in your testimony the source of current behavioral and mental health crisis in the schools, and I heard your comments to Ranking Member Owens earlier. But I want to follow up on one specific part of your testimony. You said school closures were driven by the strength of the teachers' unions and the partisanship of local decision makers. In your written statement, you have citations for those claims, but could you give us some justification for that statement now? And then I have one more question I'd like to ask you.
Absolutely. That was a result of several studies. There was a study by John Vallance at the Brookings Institute, kind of center-left think tank, that found that community spread was not a predictive factor of school closures. There were studies by Boston University's Michael Hartney, as well as Corey DeAngelis and Nicholas McCredis, that found that local union strength by a variety of measures or partisan strength within school districts, to my recollection, were far more predictive measures over school closures than the disease itself. All studies can be quibbled with, but it's very, very strong correlational, if not quite causal evidence that the story that I think we're all familiar with was what unfolded.
Great. Well, I'm gonna ask another question related to data. In your testimony, you state that you fear Congress could enact federal prohibitions against seclusion and restraint based on numbers that do not tell us what we think they tell us. I have two questions related to that. First, can you further explain what it is about the data that might be misunderstood? And second, what data do you think is needed to help keep students safe?
Absolutely. We covered part of that with Representative Owens regarding sources of racial disparities, but in terms of students with disabilities, we need to first focus on what this data actually says. Frequently with tragic cases, students with autism are mistreated. There are so many things that go wrong before that data point is reached. That's what we should be addressing. Another sometimes misleading data point is the conflation of students with disabilities who are identified as emotionally, behaviorally disturbed. That creates a kind of statistical tautological artifact where there's a designation based on misbehavior, and misbehavior is more likely to lead to consequences for misbehavior. That becomes part of our alarm. That also, unfortunately, frequently leads us towards techniques, towards these students in particular, that will be counterproductive for them as well as for the rest of the class.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. And now I'd like to recognize our newest member of the subcommittee, Ms. Phyllis McCormick. Please, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Chairman Scott. I yield back.
Chairman Scott, sir, you have Ms. McCormick's 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Eden, did you say that science was an ideology?
I did not say that science was that ideology. I intended, and I think I made myself clear. If I didn't, I'll do apologies, that frequently ideological and politically self-interested decisions are given the imprimatur of science in the public policy discourse. Even if they're not...
Is science, if you're in the middle of a pandemic, is science to be ignored?
Science is neither to be ignored nor to be exploited. Science is not to be identified with a particular individual or one contingent reading of data, which can lead you to conclusions that belie the true scientific process, which is a process of falsifiability.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question about evidence. Is there evidence that restraint and seclusion is more frequently and disproportionately inflicted on Black students?
There is, and then with all scientific questions, there's a question of why is the data saying what the data is saying behind what the data is saying.
Okay, and disabled students, it's disproportionately inflicted?
There's, again, a very deep question about the sources of disproportionality. And if we look at numbers and call raw aggregate data, if we call looking at raw aggregate data without analysis science, then we're not doing science. We're calling something science that is an ideologically willful.
Okay, then what is the reason for the disproportionate use of restraint and seclusion against Blacks and disabled students?
These were things that I'd covered a little bit with the other ones, with the other questioners. Frequently, they are responses to misbehavior. Misbehavior has various roots: deep inequities in family structure, poverty.
Are you suggesting that Blacks and disabled are misbehaving more and deserve the increased restraint and seclusion?
It's not a question of whether or not they deserve. It is a behavior that deserves a response. It's not a question of whether a student deserves a response on the basis of anything except for his or her behavior.
Okay, Ms. Harper, is there any evidentiary basis for what Mr. Eden just said?
Just to be perfectly clear, there's no evidence that addressing disparities would make schools less safe. The evidence that there are disparities by race and by disability in the use of exclusionary discipline and in punitive discipline in the use of seclusion and restraint is absolutely clear. The reason why we should not fear any effort to address discipline disparities is, one, for disparities by race. The vast majority of the disparities in low-level subjectively defined offenses: insubordination, defiance, disruption. And research has shown that, the inconsistent application of subjectively defined offenses has poor implications for children of color. One study showed that given a scenario, identical scenarios, the only difference between them is teachers were led to believe that the child in one scenario was white and the child in another scenario was Black. Teachers were more likely to label the scenario with a Black child as that child being a troublemaker. So we know that those low-level subjectively defined offenses are just a problem for children, for children of color, particularly Black children, and for students with disabilities. It's absolutely the case. Black children are 80% more likely than all other racial and ethnic groups to be identified with emotional disturbance. But the promise of IDEA is that children are not discriminated against on the basis of their disability. And that means to meet IDEA's promise of a free and appropriate public education, students identified with emotional disturbance must have an IEP that includes the behavioral supports they need to support their participation in the general education curriculum. The Department of Education in 2016 delivered guidance to make clear that IEPs have to include not just academic supports, but the behavioral supports that students need to continue to participate in school. And when they don't, we are denying them a free and appropriate public education, and we are doing so on the basis of their disability.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me. Okay, I guess Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller, sir, you
Yeah.
have 5 minutes.
Yes.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate all of our witnesses being here today to discuss the important, this important topic. School safety is an essential goal, and it should be an essential goal that each member of this committee shares. If students do not feel safe, they will not be able to properly learn and develop academically. We need to do everything we can to be a partner to local communities as they work to educate every student and give them the chance to pursue their passion. Signed into law in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act required each state to develop a plan for supporting school districts' efforts to reduce ineffective school policies that compromise student health and safety. Among other items, Pennsylvania's plan included that local control and flexibility are essential in its efforts to educate students and help them succeed in the classroom. Mr. Eden, can you say a bit more about your work to evaluate school safety policies and some of the negative effects that have occurred when policies become too lenient?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question. And just want to take a moment to address Representative Macbeth, and I'm so sorry for your loss. It's not a loss I can personally relate to on a human level, but it's a loss that I have an indirect relationship based on work that I've done to explore this question. A few years ago, I met a man named Andrew Pollock, whose daughter Meadow was one of the 17 murdered at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And he wanted to know why. He wanted to know why was it that a student who had had the police called to his house 45 times was never arrested? A student who threatened to kill his classmates, threatened to rape his classmates, threatened his classmates' families, who brought bullets to school, knives to school, put dead animals on his peers' table. A student who, while it was happening, everybody knew that it was him. Everybody said that they saw something. They said something, but nothing happened. And so Mr. Pollock wanted to know why. He and I worked together to look at every failure that we could identify within the Broward County School District, which was the first school district to go whole hog on this kind of restorative justice, disciplinary leniency approach to school discipline. And we found quite a few problems related to that were related to points of failure here. For one thing, the school had a policy, an almost blanket policy, not to arrest students. You got 4 free misdemeanors a year before you could be referred to law enforcement. And that was frankly the tip of the iceberg when it was implemented. So it became all but structurally impossible for a student who should have been flagged with a felony that could have stopped him from getting a gun to be flagged with a felony, to get that first check on it. There are mental health issues that were at failure, to be sure, but frankly, seclusion and restraint played a role as well. This is a student who should not have been in a traditional classroom environment. This is a student who deserved to be treated somewhat specially at the Cross Creek School where he attended. Unfortunately, shortly before he got to Cross Creek, Florida State Board of Education, to my recollection, issued an order from on high to limit seclusion and restraint, putting up a whole bunch of paperwork burdens. And it got to the point where teachers couldn't use that technique. The whole school, according to the correspondence with one special ed teacher there, went to chaos. Without that tool, they couldn't manage their classrooms. Without that tool, a kid who seemed a little bit quieter, a kid who also said that he dreamed of murdering his classmates, was not only put back into a traditional public school as soon as he evinced a few months of calm behavior, he was actually placed in JROTC. This school district that had gone whole hog with these leniency policies, lowering suspensions, lowering expulsions, lowering arrests, limiting seclusion and restraint, took a student who they knew quite well, whose history they knew quite well, and allowed him to re-enter a public school and allowed him to practice shooting in it. There's a kind of normal human judgment failure here. And the question that Mr. Pollock and I were trying to answer was, how do you get a school district where this normal human judgment doesn't happen? And the overarching answer isn't necessarily any particular policy, because there were so many of them. But the overarching answer is that when pressure comes down from above, pressure that suggests to a teacher, to a principal, that rather than use their judgment of what they think's best for the student and the classroom in front of them, that they should operate with an eye towards numbers that are coming down from on high, they're being told they should get lower. It just kind of perverts that normal judgment that keeps students safe. And the really disturbing thing, the thing that still keeps me up at night, is that these policies were then exported to school districts across the country and are common practice these days, and probably in the majority of school districts in America.
I guess that would lead me to, what, in your opinion, what can we as Congress provide as tools to local educators without prescribing a problematic one-size-fits-all policy?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Eden. Now, could you provide a response in writing to Mr. Keller's last question, please?
Absolutely. An apology to Mr. Keller. I'm a little bit passionate about that project, given its scope and scale.
You ate your time up, Mr. Keller. Thank you. Let me now recognize Mr. Desonier for 5 minutes. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad you're wide awake and with us. First of all, a comment to my wonderful friend and colleague, Congresswoman McBath. Thank you for your passion. Your grief has been a source of, in your action, of solace to people. So I love and respect you so much. And today's a rough day, I'm sure, but it doesn't go unnoticed that what you've done with your grief. Your son's with us. I'd like to focus on some of the things we agree with, and Mr. Eden, hopefully you're listening, and go back to some of the great work we've done on bipartisan level. And Congresswoman Fox isn't with us here, but we've had multiple conversations about behavioral health and evidence-based research. We did this on criminal justice reform. We've done it in California, where I'm from, as a former juvenile probation officer. We've done it for 25 years, in my experience, on going upstream and looking at the trauma, the early childhood effects, both in school and at home. We really focus on outcomes. I think we could really do wonderful things. And I'm looking at the ranking member who I know we've had discussions about this. We've had wonderful hearings on the HELP subcommittee that I chair. So in that regard, Mr. Eden, you talked about this, but I want to sort of direct this at Ms. Harper. In Contra Costa County, I represent about 1.2 million people here in the Bay Area. In Los Angeles County has a similar risk assessment, but we've worked for quite a while with law enforcement, with prosecutors, with the juvenile probation departments, and the school districts, teachers who in these high cost areas are very often really overworked. And it's hard to recruit them, particularly in disadvantaged communities. I represent some of the wealthiest communities in the Bay Area and some of the poorest, and the disadvantage and the resources, the requirements for maintenance of effort from state grants and programs and federal. So if we look at the evidence-based research, and Mr. Eden, to your comments on the risk assessment side, having looked at this from a public safety standpoint, you're right, there are mistakes and we're learning. But if we take the examples, Los Angeles County, largest county in the United States, worked very closely through multiple administrations, both with the mayor's office and the superintendent of the largest school district in the country. We can do risk assessments. Are there missed cases? Absolutely. And this also, I would opine, and there's some evidence-based research to deal with this, is the access to behavioral health services, counselors for the kids, for the parents. Parents should be the determinator, but they have to have the information. And parents who are single family, parents who are dealing with stress and poverty and housing, they can't make these decisions on their own. They need as much evidence-based research that we can communicate with them as possible. So Ms. Harper, maybe just a comment about the climate in the schools to change the culture from using restraint and giving the support to the administrators, the teachers, and the parents. I have a great bill that I've done with G.T. Thompson, a number of years. Many of you have voted for it, for child engagement centers. They're now out around the country. So could you talk to us a little bit about that, using the evidence-based research, acknowledging that evidence-based research is organic and is changing and has its own biases, no matter how we try, but changing the climate, giving the resources to the parents, the teachers, the administrators, and public safety.
I spoke in my testimony about, the importance, of consistent support, that consistent support that, allows schools to put in place the building blocks of prevention. Risk assessment is wonderful, but in cardiovascular health, we don't start with screenings. We start with healthy living, good food, exercise. It's the same thing for schools. How do we build those great relationships? How do we foster strong, student mental health? Right now, more than half of youth across the country receive mental health services in schools, but fewer than half of all schools offer mental health treatment services. And again, there's the challenge I spoke of earlier about shortages of school counselors and psychologists. And beyond services, there does need to be a narrative shift about how we look at behavior. Consider a child with trauma sitting in math class, having trouble concentrating on a lesson. If they have a history of abuse, perhaps what they're focused on is the teacher's mood rather than the teacher's words, because that's what they have to do at home and in the community to alert them to danger. If they've witnessed violence, perhaps they are listening carefully, but they are so anxious that their brain literally has trouble processing language. If our story about that child is that they are spacey, don't care about their education, or that they're disrespectful, if our response to that child is corrective action rather than support, then our schools become the source of harm and trauma rather than the lifelines that they can be.
I must apologize again. I'm sorry. I hate doing this. It's against my nature, but I have to call time, Ms. Harper. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't sometimes help myself and I get in trouble, but my colleagues are likely, here attempting to distract from the fact that they have repeatedly voted to block funding for public education, even as students struggle to recover from the pandemic. But we must stay focused on fulfilling our role in education, securing the support students need to learn and ensuring teachers can provide students with high quality education. So let me see, who do we have next? Let me see here. Mr. Groffman, sir, welcome back. You have 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes.
Super friendly subcommittee chair. Let me run amok. We have a couple of questions here for Mr. Eden. Our friends on the other side of the aisle are arguing for a more positive approach to student misbehavior. I have a couple of questions. First of all, could you tell me the degree to which you think positive approaches should play more of a role in these problems?
Unfortunately, I would say to a more limited degree than ever before. We frequently hear with regards to social emotional learning in particular, that it is a proven track record that we know from X many studies that will improve outcomes, do all these things that we want to do, while ignoring the fact that in 2019, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning redefined what social emotional learning is. And they redefined it along terms that were broadly characterized by critical race theory. So there's a big concern that I have about where social emotional learning is going to go when parents realize that what's sold to them as this is just to help your kids get along, this is just to help your kids regulate their behavior, is actually quite frequently in practice, perhaps training them in ideologies, training them dispositions, training them to be activists. So if we're talking about the kind of positive approaches, PBIS as it existed 5-6 years ago, social emotional learning as it existed 5 years ago, there's a role for that. But what it is today, I'm very concerned about.
A more specific example then of what you're teaching kids if that's adopted.
Yeah, I mean, there have been plenty of examples where they will ask, very young children about their gender identity and ask them leading questions about their, acceptance or disposition towards gender identity far before they hit puberty. That's one thing that gets parents very perturbed. You can also see a kind of crossover effect between critical race theory generated pyramids of oppression and the kind of growth mindset thing that we all used to agree on. So those are those two concrete examples. I'd be happy to supply more in writing after the fact to you, if you'd like.
I had a a school around here in which the teacher clearly implied that discipline was race-based without any evidence. Is that a concern? Is that what you're trying to bring up?
Oh, that's another major concern, right? I mean, from what we've already heard in this setting, if you beg the question of why disparities exist before really looking into the numbers, before really doing kind of science analysis, then that suggests that there's an institutional racism problem. That suggests that the teachers are racially biased. That suggests, as we've kind of heard here, that the notion that bad behavior can be punished and that punishing bad behavior is a normal and healthy human response in many circumstances. There's a strong ideological worldview that is behind these practices in general. And that's before we get kind of to what's below the tip of that iceberg.
Okay, I'll give you another question. It would seem to me the easiest way to deal with this. First of all, I got him higher for just a second. I don't know of any local official who, given another federal mandate, looks to filling out those forms or taking more classes from the federal government telling them how to run things. Regardless of the problem, the idea that the federal government is the solution to schools just strains credibility. But I'll give you a question here. It seems to me the best thing we could do is to not have so many disciplinary things in the first place, or so many people acting up in the first place, and that way you wouldn't have to worry about disciplinary actions. Have there been any studies done on family structure of the children and how that affects children's behavior at school?
Yeah, the Institute for Family Studies cut the numbers, and it's pretty convincing, and it's been published in Education Next as well. And if recollection serves, students from single-parent households are about twice as likely to get suspended as students from two-parent households. It kind of goes to Representative Owen's point that he made earlier. So, the school should try to support, but the school can't parent. Parents should be the primary disciplinarians, and when that breaks down, the schools are going to have a much bigger problem to deal with than maybe they should. So there are all sorts of questions on school discipline where the locus really should fall outside the school, on the family, on society. If we ignore that entirely and we blame the school, we risk really compounding the problem.
Okay. Yeah, it concerns me because it seems collectively the federal government seems to encourage not with the old-fashioned nuclear family. As a matter of fact, a major group that has been active around here as opposed to the nuclear family. But you're saying an old-fashioned nuclear family is better for children, that we shouldn't be trying to destroy the nuclear family?
Certainly from the perspective of discipline, that there are statistical benefits evidence.
Could you please submit that response to Mr. Groffman in writing? Mr. Groffman, respectfully, your time is up.
Okay. I know.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like now to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's get back to basics here. Attending school is an essential experience for our nation's children and young adults. It shapes them intellectually, of course, but it also helps them develop the social and emotional tools necessary to interact effectively in relationships, in society, and at work, and as citizens who will shape the future of this democracy. I reminisce fondly on my own experiences attending Berkeley schools in my own district and getting in trouble, by the way. And now as a parent, celebrating and living through my 4 kids' educational experiences. But there's so much that shapes whether a student's experience at school is welcoming and supportive, or whether it's exclusionary and harmful. Creating a school climate that advocates for all students is essential. But we can't do that without having a fuller picture of the outdated discipline procedures that many schools use on certain students. For example, research by the Government Accountability Office, Child Trends, and others have shown that African-American children, boys, and students with disabilities are subject to harsh discipline at higher rates than white students and non-disabled students. So, Ms. Harper, let me ask you, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the importance of in-person learning. Can you speak to the impact of practices like out-of-school suspension on instructional time and students' academic outcomes? Do you have research on that?
So one wonderful thing is that the civil rights data collection now includes data on the number of days lost due to suspension. According to one study that looked at the 2015-2016 data, US public schools lost over 11 million days of instruction due to out of school suspensions. And the cost to students varies by subgroup. Black students lost 103 days for every 100 students enrolled. There's also quite a bit of variation by state and across school districts. In Michigan, students in Grand Rapids lost 416 days per every 100 students.
Wow.
And the impact of academic achievement is just well documented. Going back to the 2011 Breaking Schools Rule study that found an increased likelihood of grade retention. 31% of students suspended or expelled repeated at least one grade compared to 5% of students that hadn't experienced suspension or expulsion.
Wow. So despite all of these ideological attacks and this absurd attacks on teachers and their organizations, these facts are overwhelming and very, very troubling. Mr. Harper, let me ask you a question, because in your testimony, you note that corporal punishment is not just harmful to the students who are subject to it, but also to students who witness it. So can you explain how the use of corporal punishment affects the broader school climate?
I'm sorry, who's the question directed to?
I think it might have been towards me again.
No, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry, Ms. Harper. I meant to ask that to Mr. Stevens. It was in your testimony, Mr. Stevens, that you discussed that issue. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. And if you could just repeat the last part of that question, I just want to make sure.
The question essentially is, how does the use of corporal punishment not just affect the individual who's subjected to it, but the larger climate in the school, the other kids and so forth?
Yeah. So what we see is the use of all these punitive approaches, whether it's restraint, seclusion, or corporal punishment, have a tremendous impact, not, again, just on the student that this is happening to, but on others that witness these things happen. It even has a negative impact on the staff and teachers that are doing these things. To get to that, you've really got to understand the impact of trauma. So when it comes to restraint, seclusion, corporal punishment, these are all very traumatic events that are happening to a student. And if you look at how trauma affects the brain, what happens when people are exposed to trauma is they become hypervigilant. They are always on alert. And when that happens to a student or even a staff member, that often increases the likelihood of what we would call distress behavior. And distress behavior often leads to what we would term as compliance demands. And those compliance demands often lead to, rather than helping a child that's having a hard time, it leads to escalation. And that may lead to things like punitive discipline practices, which further traumatize children. And when they're further traumatized, we begin to see more distress-related behaviors. So what I would say to you is that people that are witnessing these things, people that are doing these things or subjected to them, it increases the trauma for all involved, which leads to more use of punitive practice.
Thanks so much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Now let me please next I'd like to recognize Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Owen. I'm in the car, but I'm not driving, so don't worry about it. I'm sitting in the parking lot. I hope it's everyone's goal to have a safe, healthy, and supportive schools. Due to COVID, students were forced to stay home, and in many cases, parents had no options for in-school learning. Even those students with learning disabilities were not being accommodated. Federal policies should empower parents and expand choice, not force a one-size-fits-all model on parents and their children. Mr. Eden, I agree with you that parents must be empowered in their children's education, and education must be transparent. Parents have the right to know what is going on in their child classroom. Many teachers are walking away from the profession only magnified by COVID. What is the leading cause is preventing schools from modernizing and improving the school day and teaching professions since CARES Act money went to the schools?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the CARES Act money is that very little of it went into reopening schools. In Michigan, for example, to my recollection, Flint got about $50,000 per pupil. And when I last checked, it was still remote learning. Now, what is the bar to school modernization? What is the fundamental bar to schools serving students responsibly? It operates as a monopoly, and monopolies are inefficient. If schools had to serve students like Mr. Stevens' son better, if they had to tell him what was going on constantly, if they knew that if they weren't serving his child well, he could take his child to a school that would serve him better, then I would hope it would have never gotten to the point that traumatized his son. The fact is, schools don't really have a reason to be responsive to parent concerns. We like to think that teachers are well-intentioned, and they are. We like to think the principals are well-intentioned, and they are. But they operate as part of a system. And the system doesn't really give these actors that much reason to care. One argument that I didn't have a chance to get to my remarks is that if parents had more options, if they could exit, if they said my kid's not being treated well, or my kid feels in danger, and if that mattered to the school administrator in a real bottom line way, you can bet they would be faster to modernize their practices, they'd be faster to modernize their pedagogy, they'd be faster to reopen, because private schools stayed open, they fought to stay open, sometimes they sued to stay open because they had to serve those students. Public schools in this monopoly didn't fight to stay open and don't necessarily fight to serve every child as well as they should.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned the policies being discussed today were implemented in California. Can you into more details about how that worked out?
Yeah, well, in Oregon in particular, there was a policy, an explicit statewide policy to sharply limit room clears to sharply limit restraint and seclusion. And the result was room clears. The result was when situations escalated to the point that normally a teacher could have perhaps, put a hand in the kid's shoulder, and in the best case, something a little bit more aggressive than that in the worst case, when that ability is taken away, when the teacher fears retribution from an administrator, the solution is to let the child run amok in the classroom if it gets to that point. In California, a whole bunch of districts have gone pretty hard to limit school suspensions. In Los Angeles, for example, what we saw in the statistics, is it causal? It hasn't been studied that way. What we saw in the statistics, though, was that after school suspensions were banned, arrests went up substantially. And what I think we miss in the conversation is that these are all part of a continuum of behavior, right? It's always best to manage behavior in the most mild intervention possible. But when we tie the teacher's hands, when we tell them you can't give it detention, you can't give a timeout, you can't suspend, you can't restrain a kid, heaven forbid if it comes to that situation. And if the situation demands, the need will be met in a much worse way, perhaps by a school resource officer. And that is something that, according to the stats, appears to have happened in LA, even as other districts, like to my recollection, San Diego and Oakland, have moved to ban suspensions and seen just dramatic harm to math, according to a paper by Dominic Zarecki. I think on the order of 0.17 standard deviations harm, but I can give the exact stat to you in writing later.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to recognize the distinguished and very patient colleague from North Carolina, Ms. Manning. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing on such an important topic. Frankly, I'm appalled that some of our colleagues have chosen to turn this hearing into something so blatantly political and frankly ridiculous, rather than focusing on serious issues that we should be dealing with, such as the inappropriate use of corporal punishment in schools, and the best way to deal with mental health issues that children are experiencing as a result of the loss of family members from COVID and the difficulties of living through a global pandemic unlike anything that we have ever experienced. I have recently introduced a Mental Health Wellness in Schools Act that would help address the mental health crises students have experienced as a result of the many challenges presented by this pandemic. My bill would encourage schools to educate children on mental health wellness and would increase resources to schools to hire more mental health professionals. And as I've met with our school professionals in my district, I've heard over and over how much they need more mental health professionals in schools to help students deal with difficult challenges they're facing. Ms. Harper, would increasing mental health resources in schools help address issues that could lead to disruptive behavior in a proactive manner and make for a healthier school climate?
Thank you so much for your question. Unfortunately, Child Trends is a research institute with a policy that we do not lobby. We want at all times to ensure our objectivity. So because the question is related to specific legislation, I'm unfortunately unable to answer.
Ms. Craven, any chance you'd like to weigh in on that one?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about the need for mental and behavioral health professionals in schools. And thank you for the question. I'll just say I have had the privilege of collaborating with a really excellent teacher here in Texas where I am, who often says that the responsibility of schools is to support children. And if children are experiencing a challenge like a mental health challenge, we have to pull them in, not push them out. And I think that framing is so important. Kids, as you point out, are experiencing mental health challenges that are more acute following the onset of COVID-19, particularly for the communities who we know are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And of course, even before the pandemic, we know that schools were failing to meet the recommended student to mental health ratio of 250 to 1. That's for counselors. And that failure was even greater in schools with majority of students of color whose student to counselor ratios were higher than majority white schools. As Ms. Harper pointed out, we know that lack of support, especially considering mental health needs, is particularly concerning when we couple it with the use of punitive and exclusionary discipline and school police referrals. We know that data show that millions of students in the United States attend schools with police, but no counselor, school nurse, social worker, or psychologist. And we know that's happening even though these mental and behavioral health professionals improve school climates. They're able to support individual students and adults. And we know that there's no research that shows that these other approaches are effective for really handling the underlying needs of students and adults in a school community.
Thank you. Ms. Harper, I'll go back to you. A 2018 GAO report noted approaches that some districts were taking to address discipline disparities and minimize the use of corporal punishment, which I find both appalling and deeply counterproductive, and the use of exclusionary discipline. Can you tell us more about some of those approaches and their successes?
The work isn't simply about changing a single practice. It's about changing a range of procedures across a school and changing the norms and guiding beliefs that support those procedures. And that's why it has to be school-wide. It's to promote a consistency about how we view and respond to child behavior. And there are multiple implications relevant to discipline disparities. I'll share one. That deals with how the narratives we tell about child behavior differ by race. Again, I said before, the largest discipline disparities are found in low-level offenses, behaviors that may be disruptive but not dangerous. And in that one study where researchers provided educators with a scenario about students' behaviors, educators were more likely to label a student a troublemaker if they believed the student was Black. And again, consider that child that falls asleep in class. What are the narratives we tell about that child? Do they not care about their education, or did something happen at home that interrupted their sleep? Or are they not sufficiently challenged in the classroom? Do they need more rigorous content? School-wide approaches offer an opportunity to create a common narrative about student behavior that can lead us to identify and address the underlying challenges and actually correct the behavior.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Manning. And now move on. We have Mrs. Ledlow. Mrs. Ledlow, welcome. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for taking the time to testify in front of the committee today. In Mr. Eden's testimony, he mentioned the real solution to a healthier and supportive school environment is to empower parents, to provide them with transparency, and to equip them to reassert authority over their children's education. I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad that Mr. Eden recognized the importance of bringing parents into the educational equation. At the end of last year, I introduced the Parents' Bill of Rights with over 100 of my colleagues. This legislation strengthened parental rights in education by ensuring that school districts are transparent with parents on what's occurring in their children's schools and encourage school officials to consider parents' concerns and feedback when making educational decisions. This is a reasonable, measured bill to help facilitate meaningful partnership between parents and those who educate their children. Mr. Eaton, could you please elaborate more on how parental input can lead to a healthier and more supportive school environment? And should disciplinarian issues we discussed today be regulated on a one-size-fits-all approach by the federal government, or instead determined at the local school level with parental feedback?
These issues must be determined at the local level with parental feedback because, quite frankly, no matter how much folks in DC, folks in state capitals might think they care about children and do care about children, nobody cares more about a child than that child's mother and that child's father. That child's mother and that child's father wants to know what's going on in the classroom, wants to know if there's something wrong in the classroom, wants to know why it's wrong. And once they can understand it, they'll go to the school board, they'll try to get it fixed. I'm living in Northern Virginia. A little while over is Loudoun County. That's a school district that went very hard on these lenient policy issues. A school district that went so far as to, by all appearances, cover up an egregious sexual assault on a student and try to stonewall parents, went so far as to lead to a scenario where a father who came to a school board meeting concerned about what had happened to his daughter became a national poster child for the so-called, white supremacist parent movement, as though that makes any sense. There's a man who wants his daughter to be safe, wants to know what went wrong, wants to know why. If he and other parents knew the actual data, what was happening in that school, if they knew the actual policies, if there was a line of communication, honest communication between the students, the teachers, and the families, it would have never gotten to that point. There are so many ways where distant policymaking can just disrupt that line of communication, can lead local policymakers to think they're doing the right thing, to make things worse while shoving parents out of the equation when parents should be the key part of every aspect of safe and supportive schools.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And Mr. Eaton, in the work you've done on this topic, I'm sure you come across parents who feel they have no voice on the topic of safe, healthy, and supportive schools. And we're being given the impression today that parents have a single universal view on these issues. Do you believe that that is the case, or do you believe opinions among parents are more diverse and nuanced?
Oh, I mean, we're a very diverse and nuanced country. Our parents have all sorts of opinions. There is unfortunately kind of one side of the education policy argument that happens to have a much bigger megaphone. But I think that we're seeing through organizations like Parents Defending Education, organizations like Moms for Liberty, once this information gets into moms' hands and once moms and dads have a way to make it known to the public, all of a sudden, it's a dialogue. It's no longer a monologue. There are parents with different views. And I think that over the next couple of years, we'll be surprised to find where the real weight of parental opinion actually lies.
Great. I have one more question if we have time. You mentioned in your testimony that school discipline reform along the lines of what Democrats envision in this hearing has resulted in less safe and less healthy schools, according to teachers. Why do you think teachers experience a less safe and healthy school climate when student discipline standards are lowered?
Yeah, so I want to address something Ms. Harper said earlier, which is there's no evidence that these policies lead to negative outcomes, and that's just not a true statement. There are several peer-reviewed studies, and in addition to those, there are teacher surveys that have been done by local unions who have no national voice, and they will say, a strong majority of them will say that my administrator doesn't want to deal with these issues. When they're allowed an anonymous, open-ended response, they'll say things like, my principal told me not to send a student to the office unless there was blood. They'll say something like, a student threw a chair at me and he was thrown back to my classroom with a lollipop. That's the way that these policies play out in practice, right? We look at numbers, we try to change numbers, we disrupt and destabilize the human situation. We accuse teachers of bias, we don't let them do what they think is right, and bad things will happen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Eaton. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me see now. I understand Mr. Ballman. Oh, Mr. Ballman, welcome, sir. Sir, you now have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. One of the themes that we keep hearing from our witnesses today is the trauma that our students experience because of harmful disciplinary practices in our schools. These adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are preventable. But when the trauma stems from policies in our schools, then there's no question that will feed into our communities as well. As we see in many communities across the country, the rise in violence is a serious issue we need to address urgently. In my district, which includes Mount Vernon and New Rochelle, we have sadly seen more incidents of gun violence. Earlier this month, I held a youth town hall where young people from my district discussed the challenges they have faced during the pandemic and their need for more mental health support. Ms. Harper, how do traumatic disciplinary practices like restraint, seclusion, corporal punishment, and exclusion feed into the violence we see outside schools and in our communities? How would a focus on positive school climates, healing, and the needs of the whole child and whole community help prevent this violence?
The use of exclusionary or punitive discipline practices undermines the creation of the very relationships we need to create safer schools. And let me be clear about what it is that we think we're purchasing with the use of these exclusionary and punitive discipline policies. Many times, there have been examples provided of school districts attempting to put forward lenient policies and that leading to terrible outcomes. But I'll give you the example of this past October. A South Carolina court found unconstitutional 2 criminal statutes that target disorderly behavior. And that ruling turned on 2 challenges: the lack of clarity provided to students about what behaviors they couldn't engage in, and the lack of a clear enforcement standard. And that challenge really turned on the use of vague terms: disruption, disorderliness. But bringing knives to school is not disruption. Sexual assault is not disruption. I know what theft is. I know what fighting is. I know that any school teacher could identify what a fight with injuries is, but that is different from disruption or disorderliness or insubordination. And it's those suspensions that are excluding our children in a way that doesn't keep our students or our schools safer. All it does is break the connection that students have to their school, the very connections that they need, not only to be safe and healthy and academically performing, but it's those connections that make schools safer.
Thank you, Ms. Harper. I want to focus a bit more on how best to respond to the root causes of student behavior. For decades, as both a teacher and principal, I saw how when students act out, it often comes back to trauma or unmet needs. Too often we respond to behavioral issues by criminalizing our students, especially our Black and Brown students. We suspend or expel them, which pushes them into the school or prison pipeline. Sometimes we even arrest them literally on school grounds. Criminalizing students does nothing to address the underlying issue for these students and often exacerbates the trauma, leads to worse outcomes, and perpetuates the prison industrial complex. Instead, we need to support our students through trauma-informed care and mental health care and prioritize healing for our school communities. This is why I'm proud to co-lead the Counseling Not Criminalization Schools Act, which would invest $5 billion to help schools hire more social workers and other behavioral health personnel. Ms. Craven, based on your research and experience, why is it important that we prioritize hiring counselors, social workers, and other school-based mental health personnel who are trained in trauma-informed care rather than relying on discipline practices that criminalize or exclude students?
Thank you so much for that question. As I just shared, I really like this framing of pulling students in, and that means understanding what their underlying needs are and understanding what adults' underlying needs are instead of pushing them out through exclusionary and punitive discipline and policing practices. And again, we know that's an important approach because, as you say, kids and adults are experiencing all sorts of challenges, mental health challenges, access to food, in-school bullying that may impact how they are showing up at school. And when those challenges manifest as certain behaviors or perceived behaviors, it's really important for schools to have the resources to support students and pull them in rather than remove them from classrooms or criminalize them. So the need for mental and behavioral health specialists and just people who are trained to listen and support kids in schools has always been important. And again, even more important with the onset of COVID-19. I'll say that, you know, we really, and including through the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act, what we need to do is think of this as an investment in those health professionals, and again, address policies and practices who can really help to identify and address these individual student needs, individual adult needs, and help to create safer school climates.
I'm sorry, Ms. Craven, thank you, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. So sorry about that.
No, thank you. As we go into this rotation, questions and another, I'd like to now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Scott. Please, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a GAO study showing that school disciplinary policy, the relationship between school disciplinary policies and school shootings.
Yeah, thank you very much for this, because some of this statement information being entered into the record are just incredibly
thank you.
untrue.
And second, we've heard thank you. We've heard comments blaming teachers for school closings. Let me make it clear, the schools are closed because of the pandemic. We have an airborne pandemic that was killing people. And there began a debate as to whether the schools should be open or closed. The debate wasn't whether it should be open or closed. The question was whether it should be open safely or whether it should be open unsafely. And the Democrats provided the money for ventilation. You can't have schools open in an airborne pandemic with improper ventilation. We had money for mental health professionals and counselors, nurses, PPE, additional buses, so you don't have to load so many children on a bus. We provided the resources, and then as a result, now that the schools are open, now the Republicans want to take credit. They didn't offer one vote to provide those resources to safely open. Ms. Harper, there seems to be a debate that we're trying to set the stage that the question before us is whether we have to have racially discriminatory restraint and seclusion in order to have safe schools. And if you don't have racially discriminatory restraint and seclusion, you're going to have unsafe schools. Is that what's before us, Ms. Harper?
We do not have to have racially discriminate discipline in order to have safe schools. We need, start with, again, thinking about cardiovascular health. We need healthy living. We need strong relationships. We need prevention. We need schools that can provide children and youth with the supports that they need to promote their health and their mental health. That's the foundation we need to create safe schools. And on top of that, we need policies that are clear. Years ago, when people first began implementing positive behavioral intervention supports, they tried by, just providing, trying to address behavioral challenges, with service direct to student and stopping there. And they realized that a broader shift in the climate of the school is necessary, where you fundamentally change how you look at a child's behavior. And with it, provide clear expectations to children and to adults about what is appropriate behavior in school. Thinking earlier about Representative Owen's comment about teaching behavior. Positive behavioral intervention supports is about teaching positive behavior. It's through those supports and through those services and through that focus on prevention that will give us the safe schools that we're looking for.
You talk about unclear standards. I assume you're also talking about willful defiance as an offense which kids were getting kicked out of school. Mr. Craven, are there other things you can do other than restraint and seclusion and corporal punishment that are more effective in making a school safe?
Yes, we know that there are a number of other practices that schools can adopt, including restorative practices, social emotional learning, frameworks that involve multi-tiered systems of support that really support individual students, help to identify what their needs are, and ensure that we have safe climates for all schools and adults in a school community. I would say, excuse me.
Mr. Stevens, we talked about localities. If a locality thinks that seclusion, restraint, and corporal punishment is a good idea, should we allow localities to do whatever we want, or should we have some minimal standards in terms of what's allowed?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely, we need to have minimal standards, and that's part of the reason that my son was restrained and secluded, and so many other children are restrained and secluded across the nation. You know, you may have seen in the news recently, Frederick County, Maryland was actually investigated by the Department of Justice. They found that they were discriminatory, using restraint and seclusion in a discriminatory fashion. That actually led to a settlement agreement in which Frederick has agreed to stop using seclusion as an intervention. But, you know, I just want to kind of make this point. You know, I advocated locally for stopping these practices. But if we look at these numbers, 80% of restraints, 77% of seclusions, this is a civil rights issue, and civil rights should not vary at the state line. We've got to do more to protect children that are being impacted by restraint and seclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now you're back.
All right, thank you very much, Chairman Scott. Let me see. Okay, let me just automatic. Let me see. I have Ms. Wasserman Schutz. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, both Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence and including me in this really incredibly important committee hearing. The work that I have been doing, and I appreciate the committee's assistance, is on school climate issues, and also just making sure that we focus on a prevention strategy. And so my question is, Ms. Harper, in your testimony, you stressed that a key element of creating healthy and supportive schools is adopting a prevention strategy. And that places an emphasis on strong relationships and expands student access to health, mental health, and social services. Focusing on prevention is critical, I believe, especially when it comes to instances of school violence. So Ms. Harper, can you elaborate on key elements of what you mean by a prevention strategy, and how can adopting a prevention strategy reduce threats to student health, safety, and academic success, including school violence?
Yeah. A prevention strategy focuses on mitigating risk factors and promoting protective factors. Two of the strongest protective factors when it comes to the health and safety of schools is students' connection to their teachers, their belief that they have teachers that respect them, that care about them, and have high expectations of them. And the second one is students' feeling of connection to school, that I belong here. I feel safe, within this, school environment. And students that have that sense of connection to the adults and into the environment, they don't bring weapons to school. They have stronger mental health. They have stronger academic performance. Though that is the foundation that we should be creating if safe and supportive schools are our goal. But getting there has been challenging in recent years. Over the past decade, federal support for school climate has varied dramatically with sudden investment following high-profile school shootings. And in that time, there's powerful political will to act, but that will is also matched by fears that the next school shooting is imminent. And in the face of that fear, it can be very, very difficult for public officials to reach for the research. It is difficult to bypass the strategies that feel familiar and tangible, like security measures and suspension, even if the research shows that they don't work. And in this way, the pattern of providing support to schools only after tragedy undermines the work. Schools need consistent support so that they have the resources they need to focus on services, focus on relationships so that tragedies do not happen.
It sounds like what you're describing is that you can't just pick the low-hanging fruit. you really have to invest sustained, robust support for school climate initiatives that emphasize prevention. Is that right?
Exactly. For that whole infrastructure, for the close engagement with parents and communities and other public agency partners at the local level, for training, for teachers, for their collaboration time, for programs and services for students. Those things need consistent support every day, every week, all the time.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with the committee. And really, this is why I'm proud to have introduced the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act. This is legislation that would contribute to these efforts by collecting better data on school safety and prevention measures. And that'll help us in our work to craft legislative solutions to prevent, treat, and recover from school shootings. And I do want to note, Mr. Chairman, that I'm also working on a comprehensive piece of legislation that would establish a grant program to help school districts tackle the many school climate issues that have been discussed here today. And I would love to work with the expert witnesses on this critical legislation and would ask for an opportunity to be in touch with them. Thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to the committee today. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me see. Okay, so now I'd like to now recognize the very patient member from Virginia who, together with Chairman Scott, sponsored the Keeping All Students Safe Act. Congressman Byer, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Let me just begin by saying that no one is talking about lowering school conduct standards, which is something I heard today. Let's also say I heard, and I quote, and I have great respect for AEI, and I've enjoyed listening to Dr. Eden, but quote, let's talk about how these policies work in practice. We know how they work in practice. They are destroying the lives of thousands of children. 2 major GAO reports have documented all the tragedies that have existed. If we don't need some national policy, why are there 22 states with no standards whatsoever? Let's also remember that when we talk about empowering parents, I'm a very empowered parent. I've been to scores and scores of parent-teacher meetings and served on the board of the school, et cetera. That the kids of color that are being victimized, that the kids with disabilities, especially the kids with autism that are getting victimized, also have the most overwhelmed parents, and often the parents with the least political power, the ones who can't run for school board or can't go spend evenings beating them up. It's up to us. When we talk about the federal government is not seeking to impose its will, members elected by constituents in real life are asking us to step in and do something to protect these children. So, Mr. Stevens, if there's one change you could make in all schools nationwide for children like your son now to help reduce the use of restraint and seclusion, what would that be?
Congressman Byer, I want to thank you and Congressman Scott as well for introducing this legislation. I think it's critical. One change, well, I have a mighty long list, but if I had to start with one change, it would be around training. And that's why I'm such a big supporter of this legislation. I don't believe that any teacher or staff member wants to become a teacher or staff member because they want to restrain and seclude children. The truth is that restraint and seclusion are outdated crisis management approaches at best. At worst, they can be abusive. And we've seen that not only in Frederick County, recently in Fairfax County, Virginia, where children have been repeatedly restrained and secluded, and it is traumatically damaging. So what I would say is training is one of the most important things, and that leads to a change of culture. And there are, this is the thing, there are far better things that we can be doing aside from locking very young disabled children in seclusion rooms or restraining them to the ground. And I want to be clear here, because the use of restraint, kids have died being physically restrained. Think about this for a second. Physical restraint can be deadly force. And Mr. Eden mentioned kind of this idea that, well, if talking nicely to the child is not enough, it's not a matter of when, but if they're going to be restrained and secluded. You don't go from deadly force, from asking somebody nicely to deadly force. This is why training is critical. We've got to get people better tools to help support kids, and there are far better things we can be doing.
Thank you. Thanks to the magic of Google, I discovered this afternoon that there are 13,800 school districts in America. I'm just trying to figure out, with empowered parent, which we are, how you can have 13,800 different standards across this country. So Mr. Stevens, can you talk to me, what's the landscape look like across the country right now on seclusion and restraint?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, it's really dismal. We have a patchwork of laws across the nation. We have districts that have policies that aren't even always in sync with their state laws. We have some laws that are very good. We have some laws that are very bad. However, despite it, I live in Maryland. We have some of the stronger laws in the nation. That was not enough to protect my son from what happened to him. We find places like Colorado where a child can be restrained for 4 minutes and 59 seconds and they don't actually call it restraint. We've seen cases in North Carolina where it has to meet a certain amount of time before they'll refer to it as seclusion. Different standards on when these interventions can be used. In some cases, they can be used for things like property damage. Other times they're only for imminent serious physical harm or life and death situations. All over the country, I talk to parents that are impacted by these interventions. And again, think about this idea. Kids have died being physically restrained. You've got to have a minimal bar here. I don't believe that seclusion is ever an appropriate intervention for a very young child. Being thrown into a seclusion room is not calming. It's not therapeutic. And we should be banning dangerous forms of restraint like prone and supine restraint that have not only killed kids in schools, but also have killed adults across the country. So we absolutely need to have.
Can you reinforce one more word for me too? You said minimal. Aren't we talking about minimum standards across the country?
Absolutely.
Can always go farther.
Absolutely. And in fact, I highly support this legislation. I think it's a great step, but we're always looking at what we can do better, because I'm a firm believer that if we have the knowledge, if we can do better, we have an obligation to do better. We have more knowledge now about trauma, about how the brain works, yet we're still relying on outdated approaches that are quite dangerous to children and staff. And, I think that we can make our schools safer for students, teachers, and staff, and reduce and eliminate practices like restraint, seclusion, and corporal punishment.
How ironic we could have minimal standards for the safety and health of our workers, but not our children. I yield back.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Byer. And now I see that Ms. Presley has joined us. Ayana, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Chairman Sablan and Ranking Members Owens for granting me the opportunity to participate in what is really a critically important hearing today. Now, throughout the course of this pandemic, more than 160,000 children have lost a parent, grandparent, or primary caregiver due to its disparate impact on Black, Latinx, American Indian, and Alaska Native children were more than 4 times likely to lose a loved one. A recent report showed that Black and Latinx girls were more likely to have to take on primary caregiver roles for younger siblings and cousins, and more likely to work as frontline workers over the course of the pandemic. The anxiety and the psychological toll has led to sharp spikes in attempted suicides and other mental health crises. The unprecedented hurt, harm, trauma, and grief that our young people are carrying in their emotional backpacks is undeniable. Now more than ever, our students need safe, nurturing, and healing school environments where they can learn and thrive and feel safe most of all. But for too long, our schools, instead, they have been sites for criminalization and punishment, discriminatory and harsh discipline policies which push our students, particularly Black, Latinx, Native American girls, and Black girls with disabilities, out of the classroom and into the school to confinement pathway through suspensions and expulsions at damning and alarming rates. Ms. Harper, do you believe this pandemic has induced youth mental health challenges and unprecedented levels of childhood trauma, and that will exacerbate the school push-out crisis?
So 2 dynamics here. To your first question, I said before in my testimony, you say 160,000 children, have lost a parent or grandparent. I noted, 1 in 500 as of June 2021, and that preceded the Delta and Omicron variants. The loss of a parent is well known, well established as an adverse childhood experience. Without knowing the research jargon, I think many people would agree that the loss of a parent is destabilizing in a young child's life. And we know that, traumatized young children, they they can experience different kinds of challenges, being, forming relationships, processing language. So there's the potential for academic barriers and externalizing behaviors. Also a potential for them to withdraw, from within their classrooms. So we have to create contexts where we are in a position of asking why when we see a child's behavior changing, their academic performance shifting, rather being in a stance where, again, those narratives are really important here, assuming a disrespectful child, a child that doesn't care about their education. The narratives we use about young children matter, and they drive how we respond. To create supportive schools, our narratives need to be about asking why and getting to the root challenges behind whatever behavior we're seeing with a young person.
Thank you. Exactly, right. As we've often spoke about the need for for learning communities to be trauma informed, and the question is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you instead. And in fact, my Ending Pushout Act would help to do just that by supporting states and schools that commit to ban these discriminatory discipline practices and instead invest in trauma-informed care and supports and restorative justice programs and more. My bill would also strengthen the Department of Education civil rights data collection so that we can spot these harmful trends and increase resources for its offices of civil rights so they can hold districts accountable for violating students' civil rights. Ms. Craven, why is it important that we strengthen data collection on disparities in exclusionary school discipline and other punitive discipline methods like corporal punishment? Why does the data matter?
Data matter because they allow us to have a full picture of what's happening in our schools. We need to know data overall, and we also need to understand data disaggregated by different student groups and how different student identities intersect. So what does discipline look like for Black boys with disabilities, for example? And having that data gives us a richer picture of what is happening to students so that we can understand why it is happening, change our policies and practices, and make sure we're investing in the tools that schools need in order to stop those harmful practices.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that which gets measured gets done. So that is why we need the data and the transparency of that data. I mean, truly the only receipts that matter in this moment, because we can't stop just at data, are policies and budgets. And for too long, the federal government has been complicit in subsidizing the criminalization and over-policing of our children.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you very much. And I see that I think all our members have asked their questions. Let's proceed and trying to close this hearing. But first, I'd like to remind my colleagues that pursuant to the committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So by close of business on March 2nd, 2022, and preferably in Microsoft Word format. The material submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing, and only a member of a subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing records. Documents are limited to 50 pages each, and documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame, but please recognize that in the future, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record should be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to edandlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. So again, edandlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their participation today. While sometimes it's hard to keep a straight face, I'm duty bound to do so. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be open for 14 days in order to receive this response. And I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. And the The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I'd now like to recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Owen, for his closing statement. Sir, Mr. Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all the witnesses, the insight, perspective you brought. Let me just make sure we make one thing very, very clear, because you're going to hear my side of the aisle talk a lot about the teachers union. We're not talking about teachers. My parents are teachers. They love teaching. They're the profession they gave everything toward. There is a union, though, that's given us a whole different perspective and direction. We have to make sure we're staying on top of that. So I just want to make that clear. And I also like to just say that the purpose for our kids going to school is for one purpose only, that is to learn. They go there, they hope to have a safe environment. And just as we enter our workplace, we get up every single day, go to our workplace, knowing there's going to be no chaos. We're going to go to work, we're going to do our job, come back home. Our kids should expect the exact same thing. If there's chaos in our school system, there's bullying in our school system, if there's gangs in our school systems, those people need to be removed, period. There's the issues they can be dealing with, and it's really not up to the teacher to figure all that out. The teacher's not there to be the parent. The teacher's there to teach 20, 30, 40 kids in a day to be the best producers, to be able to think, to be able to give back to our country. They're there to do their job. And we have to make sure that we're looking at systemic issues of what's going on, now, issues we're dealing with. And by the way, let's not continue to mix the idea of those who are disabled, who really do need support. They need a very special attention and patience, as opposed to those kids that are coming from homes, dysfunctional homes. And for the most part, Black homes are in that process of trying to figure out a way to come back. So let's make sure we understand that, and we're dealing with those problems in a way that we can make sure that each subset is dealt with in a way that should be. Every child, no matter what their color, what their background, what the issues should be given the best education possible. And that means that we need to make sure that our classrooms are safe, our teachers are safe, and we can teach and learn and move forward. And I think we can do that. We can't do that, though, by not acknowledging the fact that we have some issues in our classrooms, and those who should not be there should be taken out and dealt with in a different way. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Owens. And one of the reasons we're having this hearing is because of this particular problem that's doing more harm than good to many of our students. And so before I make my closing statement, I have some items to submit for the record. I want to thank Chairman Scott for submitting the 2020 GAO report, but I'd like to submit 4 letters from the Federal School Discipline and Climate Coalition. One letter is to the House Education and Labor Committee leadership and the Senate Health leadership requesting action to address system racism. The second letter is to Senator Murphy and Representative Presley in support of the Counseling, Not Criminalizations in Schools Act. The third letter is to the President on federal school discipline and climate recommendations. And the fourth letter is to officials of the Department of Education and Justice on supportive approaches to reopening schools. I would also like to submit a letter from the Leadership Conference to members of Congress in support of legislation to advance safe, healthy, and inclusive climates. Additionally, I submit to the record a report from the American Psychological Association titled Corporal Punishments Does Not Belong in Public Schools, end quote. I'd like to submit 2 briefing papers from the School Policing's Research to Policy Collaborative, and I ask unanimous consent to enter these documents into the record. Without objection, so ordered. And let me now make my my closing statements. Again, thank you very much to our witnesses for your expertise and testimonies. I apologize about sometimes cutting you off in the middle of your statements. It's common practice and the rule. But unfortunately, even before the pandemic, far too many students experience outdated and punitive discipline practices like corporal punishment, seclusion, restraint, suspension, and expulsion that harm students' achievement, academic achievement, and mental and behavioral health. And as our witnesses shared, these practices are disproportionately used against students with disabilities and Black and Brown students, and I may add Pacific Islanders. Now, for students to recover from the pandemic and get back on track, it is more crucial than ever that students return to safe learning environments that support their social, emotional, and economic growth. So this is why congressional Democrats passed President Biden's American Rescue Plan, which delivered the resources schools need to hire more school counselors and mental health professionals. We're also working to advance legislative proposals like Keeping All Students Safe Act to help schools implement evidence-based strategies that create healthier learning environments. Again, thank you again to our witnesses, and I look forward to our continued work to support student success and well-being. And from a place where it is 78 degrees, if there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned so I can go surfing.